Have you ever held your livelihood in your hands, or the livelihood of your families? For food service workers, this little book, also known as a server book or a checkbook, is their livelihood. More importantly, what's inside, what's given to them by customers, is what makes their living wage. I think it's widely understood and known that the minimum and sub-minimum wage in America is not a livable income, and food service workers rely heavily on the tips that they make to have a livelihood. It's important to understand that food service workers need at least a 15 to 20% tip on every sale that they make in order to make a living wage that they can support themselves and their families with. If they don't get tipped enough, or if they don't get tipped at all, that can put them in very strenuous financial positions for themselves and their families. Let's create a little math equation. If you work an 8-hour shift and you are given 10 tables throughout that 8-hour shift, every bill comes out to $100 and they tip you 15% with every tip. You make $15 off of each table, and so at the end of the night you have $150. Let's say you have $150 every night for 5 days, so that gets you at $750. Let's multiply that by 4 and you get $3,000 a month. A lot of people say that they can live off of $3,000 a month, but a lot of people can't. But that's the reality that food service workers face on a daily basis. As a food service worker with over 5 years of experience in the industry and in different restaurants, I can fully attest that tips are a food service worker's livelihood. Tips are what make your income, because especially in a sub-minimum wage state like South Carolina, the only thing that you're getting paid by your employer is $2.13 an hour. And most of the time, in fact, all of the time, you don't even get to see that money because it's taken out by state and federal taxes. So the tips that you make from your customers day in and day out is the only source of income that you have if you just have that one serving job. That's why it's so important that customers and diners alike understand the amount of gratuity that is needed to make sure that our servers are getting a livable wage. In this speech, I'm going to talk about the importance of customers tipping their servers a correct amount so that they can depend on the money that they make to support their families. I'm going to talk about the issues that food service workers are facing due to people not tipping them. And I'm also going to talk about the things that we can do as a community to make sure that our food service workers are getting paid livable wages, and we can end the debate of whether food service workers should be tipped or not. Let's examine the root cause of why it's important to tip our food service workers. According to an article by Sylvia Allegretto and David Cooper in the Economic Political Institute, the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers has remained at $2.13 an hour since 1991. In 1996, it was decoupled from the regular minimum wage such that the tips were raised such that the tipped wages were remaining at $2.13 an hour, while regular minimum wage was increased. At the time, the tipped minimum wage was equal to 50% of the regular minimum wage, but today it is only equal to a record low of 29.4% of the regular federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Going back to our math equation, if you're making $3,000 a month in 1996, that's probably very livable. But in today's society, 30 years later, while everything is increasing, while every aspect of living costs is increasing, rent, mortgage, insurance, grocery bills, gas, everything is increasing but a sub-minimum wage. If you haven't ever heard of the One Fair Wage campaign, let me tell you a little bit about what it stands for. The One Fair Wage campaign is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization in the United States that's led by Saru Jayaraman for restaurant workers to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers who make less than the minimum wage before tips. Jaru added to the campaign saying that 7 of the country's 15 lowest paying jobs are tipped occupations. As a result, tipped workers in states with a sub-minimum wage are more than twice as likely to end up in a poverty state of living and rely on things like Medicaid and other government assistances to remain steady. Because tipped workers are predominantly female, the poverty burden falls disproportionately on women. So now that we've examined the issues with minimum and sub-minimum wages in the food service industry, let's examine the issues that service workers are facing when they're not being tipped accordingly. According to Irene Tung, who wrote in an article in the National Employment Law Project, waiters and bartenders earn more in tips than they do from what employers pay them as an hourly base wage. The median share of hourly earnings that comes from tips accounts for 58.5% of waitstaff's earnings and 54% of bartenders' earnings. On a monthly basis, these tips do add up, and they found that the median monthly tip earnings for waitstaff and bartenders is $867 a month, suggesting that many of these workers depend on their tips to pay for essential expenses like rent and utilities. As a woman who works a full-time job, is in college, and supports herself financially, making $867 a month would never allow me to be financially independent. An article posted by the Toast tab that I had read recently states that in a full-service restaurant, it's important to tip at least 20% of your tab. If you think that that's a high number, you probably don't know that most of the time these servers aren't getting that amount of money. Instead, they actually have to tip out their bar staff, their bussers, and their hostess. This tip out is commonly a percentage of food and beverage sales, regardless of what they were tipped by the guest. So essentially, if they're stiffed or weren't tipped at all, then they're most likely losing money. To bring in our mathematical equation again, let's say you're at $150 a day, making $750 a week, $3,000 a month. You make $150 a night, but you have to tip out your bartender, your hostess, and your food runner. And you have to tip them out all out 5%. So that's 15% of your tip income going to others that help run the restaurant. 15% of $150 is $22.50. So that's $22.50 that you are losing going to other people. That leaves you at $127 a night. Now that we've established the main issues in the food service working industry, let's talk about the things that we can do as a community to make sure that those who are serving us are able to provide for themselves and their families. Again, the One Fair Wage campaign has stated that the restaurant industry is one of the largest growing industries in the nation and is one of the second largest employers of minimum wage workers, employing at least 25% of all American minimum wage workers at $7.25 an hour, as well as 65% of all American sub-minimum wage workers at $2.13 an hour. Wouldn't it be fair to assume that putting more money into the pockets of those who are serving us that aren't making a minimum wage would allow them to put more money into our community? They would be able to spend money in local shops and businesses. They would be able to add more to local and state taxes, increasing consumer spending, and that boosts our nation's economy. They also stated that certain states that require employers to pay the full minimum wage of $7.25 an hour to tipped workers have a higher employer growth rate for tipped workers. Full service restaurant employment, or FSRE, in One Fair Wage states grew by 14.4% between the years of 2012 and 2017, while an FSRE in Sub-minimum wage states only grew by 11.7%. Though there's only a 2.7 growth rate difference between the one fair wage states and sub-minimum wage states, you have to put it into perspective. If your state is populated by 1 million people, 2.7% of that 1 million is 27,000 people. So 27,000 people are now being paid a minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, on top of what they're being tipped. In conclusion, based on the evidence that we've talked about, it's quite easy to understand that food service workers are at a huge disadvantage due to the sub-minimum and minimum wages that they are forced to work in, and they rely heavily on the gratuity and tipping of the customers they serve. It's important for customers to understand that tipping between 15 to 20% of their bill is the only way that servers are going to have a livable income. It's the only way they're going to be able to support their families, support themselves, and support their community. By making customers and the general public aware of why it's vital for them to tip their food service workers accordingly, we can help make sure they receive livable wages and ultimately aid in the destruction of poverty among our food service workers and our community alike. Thank you.